Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mary Ellis Davis, and welcome to my home and welcome to this wonderful event today. I am so proud to have the speakers that we have here, and I'd like to tell you just a little bit about why I decided to have this summit. So many people have read about my story, but let me tell you just a little bit about it. I married a beautiful man. We built this home. I'll try to do it without crying because he passed away. And unfortunately, and I'm under a tremendous attack by the town of Falmouth, Maine, and also by neighbors. And the reason they're attacking me, even though it seems rather extraordinary, is that if you look out at the vista from this room, you'll see 180 acres. And the 180 acres, it was simply our yard. We didn't realize that it was everybody else's park or green space or view shed. But after my husband died, suddenly I was told that my land belonged to my neighbors and to the town, and that I should simply give my home to the town and to the neighbors for their own use, that my use no longer mattered. But of course, I received the tax bills, and I paid the tax bills. And on the tax bills, it said that the land belonged to me and the home belonged to me. I thought it was extraordinary because after going to over 100 meetings in the town of Falmouth, for everything from planning to zoning to the town council, to try to be able to receive some financial benefit, doing something either inside my home or outside, inside as a spa, possibly a private club, or outside for development from a cemetery to housing development. I basically either had a net zero outcome to any development that I wanted to do, or I simply wasn't allowed to do it at all. So it's clear that my value has been reduced on my home and property, my rights have been infringed on, and the regulations that have been put on my home and my land obviously have made it so I can't use it in the manner that I was hoping I'd be able to. So today we have several speakers, and we will start with the first one, Tom DeWeese. He will be basically the manager of this conference, and I can't tell you how glad I am he's doing it instead of me, because I'm not a speaker like Tom is and some of the others that are here today. But I can assure you that there is something that can be done about these regulations, because people open their tax bills in Falmouth and they are shocked at how their taxes are doubling overnight. And I think it will inspire people to do something. And I think that the more conferences we have like this, the more we educate people, the more that we have them understand that there is something that can be done. We don't have to sit here and pay these huge bills on taxes. We don't have to have all development stop. We don't have to lose all of our industries. We don't have to put up with our children being brainwashed in schools to believe that sustainable development is a new and wonderful way of life, that we can get rid of these regulations, that we can take the schools back, that we can do something about this. And these people are here today to tell us exactly what's going on and tell us what we can do about it. Tom DeWeese, who will be our master of ceremonies, is the president of the American Policy Center and editor of the DeWeese Report, based in suburban Washington, D.C. Tom has been in the battle for American liberty for over 35 years and is recognized as one of the nation's leading advocates for individual liberty, free enterprise, property rights, and limited government. He makes regular appearances on radio and television talk shows, and his articles have been published in several national publications and is regularly published on more than 30 internet news sites reaching more than 5 million people each week. Tom is an activist helping to organize concerned Americans in all 50 states. His Sledgehammer Action Alert system is one of the most effective, reaching more than 100,000 activists in a matter of hours. Whenever it is activated, Tom takes great pleasure in the knowledge that when their phones start ringing, Capitol Hill hates him. Today, Tom will serve as MC as well as our final speaker. And I welcome, with all my heart, Tom DeWeese.
Thank you, Mary Alice. Just to give you a word, first of all, let me say how thrilled I am that you have made it here today and weathering the storm. A couple of things are going to happen here today. One of the things that we wanted to do as I began to work with Mary Alice Davis on her situation and try to get her plight out to people around the country is I think that there's a great need for some kind of a property rights movement in Maine, and I thought if we could use her situation to help get that established, then that's what we should do. At the same time, I began to work with several people around the country. The fact of the matter is that the situation that you're facing here in Maine, that Mary Alice is facing, is happening in every city in this country, in every rural area in this country, and people are confused, people are not sure about where they're going with it all and what to do about it. And so we began to work together, several of us, to bring the message, the fact that there is a connection between the sustainable development policies, the environmental policies, and education. A lot of people don't understand. And we began to pull all this together, and what we thought we would do is create a DVD to be as a tool for activists and get it out to as many people as we could so they could use it as programming, they could use it as recruitment tools, they could get it in front of elected officials to begin to spread the message of what's happening. You know, Thomas Paine put out a pamphlet in 1775 called the Common Sense, and this was the first time that the argument for independence was told to the American people in a very easy-to-read, understandable way. And that began to be read by everybody in the country, every tavern, every street corner, every living room. People were reading Common Sense, and this drove the Continental Congress to work for independence. We thought that maybe what we could create is a modern-day Common Sense using modern technology, a DVD. And let me begin by saying this. All of us are aware that life in America has changed over the past few decades. Life is getting harder. There seems to be no end to the dire predictions of collapse and impending doom. We are told that the human race is using up the Earth's natural resources at an alarming rate, and that natural Armageddon is our destiny unless we can make massive sacrifices to our lifestyle. Using this excuse, governments, from your local city councils to the United Nations, are busy creating theories and policies designed to restructure our society, controlling development while locking away land and natural resources. And we feel great stress and even injustice at their restructuring, as their restructuring interferes with the documents and the legal institutions on which our government was founded. New policies such as smart growth, cluster development, conservation easements, sustainable development, Agenda 21, biosphere reserves, and even historic preservation challenge the ideas of private property rights, individual liberty, and free enterprise. The questions all Americans must ask are these. Is the theory of natural Armageddon true? And is the transformation of our society necessary? Or is it all just being used as an excuse to impose an oppressive political power structure that destroys private property, individual initiative, and the rule of law? Those of us speaking to you today believe the latter is true. Today it is our purpose to show you how and why we think the only result of that transformation can be the destruction of a free society through the establishment of an oppressive ecoligarchy that will rule and regulate our every move. In short, we believe we are in the midst of a war of ideas, philosophy, and values, ultimately to decide whether man will live controlled or free. And you all have a stake in getting to the facts and getting it right, because in the end, it is your liberty in the balance. Now, I would like to introduce to you our first speaker today, Michael Shaw. Michael Shaw is from Santa Cruz, California, a community that stands at ground zero in the transformation of America. That community has been implementing smart growth and sustainable development land use policies longer than any in America. If you want to know what America will look like in 10 years under these policies, go to Santa Cruz. In the mid-1990s, Michael sat on the Santa Cruz local UN Agenda 21 committees as the community began to create the sustainable structure that now subjugates Santa Cruz today. Michael is a property owner and a businessman and an abundance ecologist. A few decades ago, he purchased 75 acres of coastal property where he hoped to build a home. He soon found out that such a common American dream was now virtually impossible in sustainable Santa Cruz. So Michael took the weed-infested land that the environmentalists called natural, and he turned it into a native plant wonderland he now calls Liberty Garden. It now stands as an example of how private property provides far better stewardship of the earth than does government control. Native species now flourish at Liberty Gardens that are literally unknown anywhere else in California. Today, Michael comes to us as a founding participant of Freedom 21 Santa Cruz, dedicated to the constitutional administration of government and the essential importance private property serves in guaranteeing our liberties. Please welcome Michael Shaw.
The issue that has faced society since the beginning of time has been a very simple question. That issue is, who decides? Who decides the terms of your life? Is it you, the individual, or is it the state? If we're to resolve that that question is answered, that the individual decides the terms of one's life, that society must come to understand that to respect the dignity of human life requires respecting the private property of another. These ideas are not new to humankind. They're as old as the Ten Commandments, with the prohibitions against stealing and coveting the property of another. But they came to societal fruition with the foundation of America and the constitutional provisions that guide and govern this country. It was in those institutions that the concept of self-governance was understood to be a necessary prerequisite to leading a life that is one's own. Today, Americans know that something is wrong. What we need to do is understand where those problems originate. But to do so, we need to start at the beginning with an understanding of liberty itself. You see, liberty presumes that the government powers must be strictly limited in scope and that the law be applied equally to each citizen. In other words, for liberty to survive, governmental favoritism must be eliminated. Freedom means that we can each act on our own authority, limited by our legal responsibility not to infringe on the equal rights of another, and the moral and social responsibility to respect the dignity and the property of others. You see, in a free society, and only in a free society, are human beings able to develop their own conscience. Nurtured in a family environment, people can begin to become who they are, first by building a conscience, developing their personality, and building their own character. And it is when a conscience has been developed that people are free to express themselves and free to associate with whom they choose. And of course, the freedom to associate and the freedom to express require a natural freedom to trade with others without the use of force, each seeking mutual benefit that ends up giving a rise to society generally. Freedom is what promotes and is a prerequisite to peace. But genuine peace can exist only in free societies where truly voluntary and not compliant actions govern civic responsibility. You see, peace requires self-ownership, not a slave society where there may not be warfare because force is imposed. But for peace to exist, self-ownership and the right to determine the terms of one's own life requires, again, that we respect the property of others, even if such is adverse to our own interests. In other words, if someone is going to build a home in front of your home and block the view that you had to the ocean, we need to understand that if we are focused solely on the idea that we want to protect our property value, even though it comes at the expense of someone else's property right, we will all end up with neither property values nor property rights. It is respecting what others want to do with their lives and their property that gives each of us the opportunity to lead a life of our own. George Washington said that private property and freedom are inseparable. Well, he's right. But most Americans have come to forget what private property is. Most people think that private property is a thing. It's a land or a farm, maybe a car or your own home. But private property is much more than that. You see, private property begins with your hand. This is my hand. I choose its action, and I possess my hand. But private property begins with our very person. Our persons are our own private property. But it's more than that. It's our thoughts. Our thoughts are our private property. We need to be free to determine the terms of our life in order to develop those thoughts fully. And our expressions become our private property. So it's our person, our thoughts, our expression. It's our action. Private action is private property. Sometimes that action results in the creation of a thing, or we trade for something as a result of our work energy. But when that thing is taken from us by the government, whether it's our land, our houses, our television sets, or our books, it begins to affect that chain. If our property can be taken from us, we begin to act differently. This is why the Soviet Union failed. People didn't act in a societally beneficial way because it didn't benefit the individual. So when we seek acting in our own interests because our own interests are denied to us, we end up expressing ourselves differently, thinking differently, and until one day we wake up and we look at that hand that used to be ours and we find out that our hand is controlled by the power of the collective state. We are to do what we are told. The terms of our life is determined for us. The prerequisite for American liberty requires that the citizenry begin to reacquaint themselves with the terms of the Constitution. It is only that way that we can assure the continuation of a democratic republic and that where we can commit ourselves to doing what's necessary to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. The American culture is experiencing the consequence of a decline of individual responsibility and a rise in dependency. The principles that guide an honest economy, genuine free trade, have been abandoned. Instead, we live with increasing subsidies, barriers to entry, government regulation, and government intervention into the lives of what could be a free citizenry. The ethics of special interest politics have vested power in big government liberals and big government conservatives. The consequence of this decay have been the evolution in the purpose of American social, political, and economic institutions. For instance, think about charity. In a free society, charity receives contributions from some in order to help others. In essence, charity is both a broker and an agent of benevolence. But in modern society, many charities are 501c3s that seek grants of coerced tax revenue in exchange for their regulatory compliance. The consequence is that the incentives for charitable action are shifted from genuine benevolence to creating and meeting the needs of a growing caseload dependent upon the receipt of ever larger government grants. Coercive sources of money are incompatible with benevolent giving. Shifting charitableness from benevolence to bureaucracy contributes to social decay. The cause of this decay is not accidental. It can be traced, in part at least, to the political globalist movement. Now, as opposed to 40 years ago, there is a documented plan for the creation of a global democratic collective, and it is called sustainable development. What is sustainable development? Well, the United Nations, who coined the term, defines it this way: it is meeting today's needs without compromising future generations to meet their own needs. Well, think about that. Suppose our forefathers had not used the whale oil that brought light to the homes of a few homes in America and that brought wisdom and knowledge to the young people of that generation, and had decided instead to save it for us. Well, we might still be living in the dark. You see, human ingenuity, the greatest resource on the planet, takes problems and solves problems. Fossil fuel has brought to all of us an improving life, and now we're asked to stop using it in order to save it for future generations, as though those who come behind us, presumably living in a free society, would be incapable of improving their own lot. Such folly. You see, this concept, in fact, nearly these precise words, are not new. They come from the 1977 Soviet Constitution. The flowing and flowery words didn't work for them, and there's no reason to think that sacrifice will bring an improving world for us. At Freedom 21 Santa Cruz, we define sustainable development more accurately. We say that sustainable development is the process by which America is being reorganized around the central principle of state collectivism, using the environment as bait. This is being done while indoctrinating and preparing our children to live in a state-run collective. Now, what I'm going to do is define a few more terms and examine the operation of sustainable development in America and show how sustainable development is a program to reinvent American government. And I'll conclude by summarizing the risks and the opportunities of our time. But throughout, I will show and offer ideas on how you can advance individual liberty and equal justice in your own community. What is collectivism? Well, in short, collectivism is suppression of individuality by the state. What you think, what you do, how you express, what your job might be, what you eat, where you go, how you get there, All are components of what a truly collective society becomes. Well, what are the components of creating a collectivist society in the 21st century? Well, I think there are 4 such components. The first is a capacity for imperialism. But unlike times before us, imperialism today, to make an effective global collectivist system, requires a military force powerful enough to control the entire world. You see, as long as there's one country shining as a beacon for the rest of the world, the tyrants around the world are held to a standard to which they cannot meet. So the goal of global collectivists is to take down that shining example so that the entire world can be viewed as a single collective. Today, of course, that military power exists. It exists in the hands of the American government, which is why it is so important that the American government remain the beacon for freedom and not a partner in the rising global collective. Secondly, a global collective requires control of the monetary system. Well, here in the United States, that occurred 90 years ago with the establishment of the Federal Reserve, the granddaddy of all American government-private partnerships. Thirdly, a system of child indoctrination needs to be established so that young minds can be molded into the attitudes, values, and beliefs of a global collective. In California, our educational system requires that every government school class have a curriculum designed to create what's called an environmental voter. Our problems have not ended with the passing of Gray Davis and the ascent of Arnold Schwarzenegger. These programs are intended to continue. The United Nations has declared this decade the decade of sustainable development education around the world. It is more and more clear that our children are being indoctrinated to ideas that are foreign to the ideals of liberty. But finally, and what has not been completed, is that for a global collective to exist, natural resources and rural lands must be under the control of the government. It is precisely because in America, our rural lands and natural resources have been vested in citizen ownership that this country has fared well and that freedom has served as a beacon for the rest of the world. But that is precisely what sustainable development seeks to attack. These folks are clever. They know that most Americans live in urban areas and don't fully understand the principles I just talked about. But everything we have, everything in this room, everything in our homes, everything in our businesses, had its origin in rural lands and natural resources. And that is where the battle for the future of freedom is resting. So what might we do to help reverse this? Well, the easiest area is to begin to approach our educational process. Understand and work to eliminate the harmful indoctrination programs in the current government education system by dealing with your school boards, informing your neighbors as parents and grandparents of what is actually going on, and understand your own educational alternatives for your children and grandchildren. You see, political theory really boils down to some very simple principles. And in essence, as I suggested at the beginning, in answering the question of who decides, is it the individual or the state deciding the terms of a person's life, there are but two formulations for governmental operation. And we can see those best expressed by looking at the founding documents of this country and the founding documents of the United Nations. In America's case, the principle is based on the ideal of self-governance, which of course leads to liberty, and which is predicated on the idea of unalienable rights, meaning that the right to one's property, which creates the right to one's liberty, which gives to one a life as a human being, is a right that is inherent or imbued into our nature and cannot be stripped away. But with the United Nations, the premise is quite different. You see, state collectivism leads to tyranny, which is based on an idea of human rights, animal rights. In both cases, such rights are granted by men and can be withdrawn by men. They can be selectively enforced for some men and not for other men. What comes can go, because what we have is an elite making the decisions for all others. And today, that is showing itself in the concepts that replace life, liberty, and property. And those concepts are social equity, a new economic system, and environmental justice. You see, the modern war on liberty fosters confusion in our schools regarding the nature of what is a moral government. It causes division by dividing us into groups under the principles of social justice, replacing the concepts of equal justice. And it creates dependency through a welfare system which seeks to undermine free enterprise and establish this new economy. Well, in Santa Cruz, when we began to expose these ideas to the citizenry by taking the issue of sustainable development, or Agenda 21, to the councils that were implementing it, what we would encounter routinely is mockery. Oh, you conspiracy theorists. Well, they don't do that anymore because it's become quite evident by just looking at the United Nations' own website that Agenda 21 and sustainable development are ideas being promulgated by the international political machinery. This is from the United Nations webpage, Sustainable Development, Agenda 21, the Earth Summit, Agenda 21, which was held in Rio in 1992. You see, I sat on the Santa Cruz Agenda 21 committees. Now, this was a lot of crazy ideas. This was back in the mid-90s. Crazy ideas I heard. Mother Earth's surface wasn't to be scratched. Human beings were to be concentrated into human settlement zones. Transportation systems were to be changed. Educational systems were to focus on the environment as the central organizing principle. All aspects of life were covered. There were committees on agriculture, biodiversity, education, energy, housing, government housing, population and its control, public health, social justice, transportation, and a, quote, viable economy. Well, I went to these committees at the request of some people who told me that I needed to understand what was going on, and I came back and I said, this is craziness. This is so silly. It has no chance of having any effect on our society. Well, I was wrong. In the early part of 2001, councils and committees began popping up all over Santa Cruz County. From watershed councils for every small dabbling creek, to fire-safe councils, which were really run by the Department of Interior, coming into Santa Cruz using the fire chiefs as an excuse for imposing a county-wide habitat conservation program that would keep some landowners from walking on their property during the mating season of the long-toed salamander, as an example. Homeowner associations were suddenly changing their bylaws, getting rid of the Roberts Rules of Order and turning to stakeholder and consensus basis. Visioning sessions were held, and suddenly the newspaper, a compliant partner in this dynamic, began to propagandize the benefits of restructuring our infrastructure, becoming less reliant on cars, creating rails and trails and government-designed housing, dense housing, along the railroad track. But you see, upon further investigation, we found out the County Board of Supervisors had quietly and unanimously, back in 1997, accepted and adopted the provisions of Agenda 21. Looking even a little more deeply, we found out that in 1990, Santa Cruz had passed what was called then the Measure C, which read exactly as the Rio Accords read when they were unleashed on the world 2 years later in 1992. So you see, Santa Cruz has been a laboratory for this dynamic for a long while and is now beginning to feel the real pinch of massively high housing prices, timberlands that are ready to burn, farmers who are on rich, fertile soil who are having their water taken from them and are about ready to lose their land to collectivized farming. You see, Agenda 21 is a global land use, education, and population control program that doesn't just exist in Santa Cruz, it is now rapidly advancing in every town, burg, and state of the United States. A man named Maurice Strong, a Canadian oil billionaire, was the Secretary General to the United Nations 1992 Conference on the Environment and Development, the so-called Rio Earth Summit. Most of us heard about that at the time, but not in its full details. This is where Agenda 21, or Sustainable Development, was unveiled. And while doing so, Secretary General Strong said the following: current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class, that means average Americans, involving high meat intake, the use of fossil fuels, appliances, which means refrigeration, air conditioning, suburban housing, are not sustainable. Well, how could someone take that seriously? That's bizarre. If you don't take it seriously, you'll wake up one day and look at your hand and realize that you should have taken it seriously. What else is not sustainable under the terms of the Rio Accords and its sister document, the Global Biodiversity Assessment Report? In its own words, private property is not sustainable. Golf courses and ski lodges are not. Irrigation is not sustainable. Monotheism, commercial agriculture, and the family unit. Now, is the United Nations committed to the elimination of private property? Well, in 1976, at their Habitat 1 conference report, it was stated that, quote, private land ownership is also a principal instrument of wealth and therefore contributes to social injustice. Public control of land use is therefore indispensable. Well, oftentimes you get to that point where people say, all right, so the United Nations, which has no force and effect in the United States, has these crazy notions. Why should we be concerned? Well, here's why we ought to be concerned. In 1992, George Bush, then President George Bush, attended. Actually, he was parked in a yacht offshore of Rio de Janeiro, where he signed the Rio Accords and obligated the federal government to administratively implement these documents. Now, Congress never looked at it. The public never knew about it. But since then, federal agencies, all federal agencies, are designed around the concepts of sustainable development and their implementation within the United States. A year later, President Clinton, this is a bipartisan effort, established the President's Council for Sustainable Development. Now, that council had all of the environmental organization heads as part of it, and it had two business guys, Ken Lay of Enron and the chairman of California's Pacific Gas and Electric. Now, since then, the mayors, the county supervisors, and the governors have all adopted the principles of sustainable development, most of them not knowing what they're doing. There's a man named Jay Lawrence, J. Gary Lawrence, who was an advisor to President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development. He was a U.S. delegate to the 1996 United Nations Habitat 2 conference. He's director for the Center of Sustainable Communities up in the state of Washington, and he's a chief planner for the city of Sustainable Seattle. He said, participating in a UN-advocated planning process would very likely bring out many who would actively work to defeat any elected official who is undertaking local Agenda 21. So we call our processes something else, such as comprehensive planning. The state of Wisconsin is engaged in comprehensive planning. Growth management, or as California calls it, smart growth. And since he made these comments in 1998, other imaginative, warm and fuzzy terms have been adopted for implementing sustainable development or Agenda 21, including visioning, or common, or 2020, or community plan. Be wary of all these warm and other warm and fuzzy terms. You see, the land use element of sustainable development has two action plans. One is the Wildlands Project, which seeks the elimination of human presence on over 50% of the American landscape and heavily controlled activity on most of the rest of American land. And smart growth, which is dense human settlements subject to increasing controls on how we live and increasing restrictions on our mobility. In Santa Cruz, we have a 30-year-old two-lane freeway that needs to be substantially larger. The promise is always for widening the road. I've lived there for 20 years. The promise is always for widening the road. There's never the capacity to get that done. But instead, we're taking an antiquated old one-way, one-lane train track, spending tens of millions of dollars to acquire the right-of-way and hundreds of millions of dollars to build an infrastructure for the post-private property era. What we're doing is taxing ourselves into bankruptcy in order to put ourselves into smart growth cages. As to the Wildlands Project, the Department of Interior Bureau of Land Management has working papers from 1994. These papers are still the operating documents for that department. And they say that, quote, all ecosystem management, now that means the planet, should consider human beings as biological resources. I'll contend that the Education Department treats our children the same way. Smart growth means a new mobility, rails and trails. Doesn't that sound nice? We can all ride our bicycles, and we can get on slow-moving trains that take us to our predetermined destinations. And along those rail lines will be dense government-controlled real estate development. Compliant government partners or sustainable developers will do the business. Competition and free enterprise will be eliminated. Profits to these folks will be guaranteed, and the trains will run on time. This is a sign we're seeing increasingly, with increasing frequency around the country. Now, this particular sign comes on the other side of my town, La Selva Beach in Santa Cruz County, California. Now, the story on this is a sad one. Back in the 70s, the landowner, who was a bushberry farmer, found a unique salamander that he decided to take up to the new University of California at Santa Cruz. Well, immediately, the university went through the process and declared that salamander, a long-toed salamander, endangered. So the farmer was restricted from using his land. It was bought from him for pennies on a dollar. He went bankrupt and died. Well, the community thought, gee, we're getting a nice coastal hillside area. We can do some hiking. Not so. This property is only open to the sustainable developer federal agents. In the meantime, it's unmanaged. It's a fire trap ready to burn. And someone might presume that some salamander feels secure knowing that nobody will step on him. This map was compiled by a brilliant, brave gentleman in this audience. It was compiled from documents that were taken from Geneva just prior to the time the United States Senate was prepared to vote on the Global Biodiversity Treaty. This is in 1994. Because the Senate saw this map, and that treaty was ready to pass, but as the Senate saw this map, the treaty failed 94-0. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is it's being implemented anyway. Let me explain the map. The red sections are the wildland zones, to be devoid of human activity. That means recreational activity. It means all activities. That means that the natural materials, natural resources in those areas are unused by humankind. The yellow areas are areas for highly regulated activity. And you can see the little black dots. Those are the human settlements, or smart growth zones, where human beings are to be placed. The tool, you say, well, this is not possible. You know, this is not achievable, and that's certainly what I would have thought 5 years ago. But an array of tools have been used by the government agents for implementing this. conservation easements, which transfer your property right to the government. You might still be able to use it under their blessing for a while, but a generation from now, that blessing will be gone, and those lands will be controlled fully by the government. Remember, Agenda 21 is the plan for the 21st century to remake human societies in this collectivist image. Regulation is another major tool. In Santa Cruz, sits on a bay that runs from Monterey to Santa Cruz County. It's 26 miles as the crow would fly across the ocean from one point to the other. But we have a national marine bay sanctuary that covers, people in our community don't know this, but it covers 5,000 square miles. 400 miles of the California coast are under the ambit of the Monterey Bay Sanctuary. Fishermen are feeling that pain already, but what's not understood is that half of that coverage is landmass. From the ridgetop to the shoreline is also covered under regulations and 25 governmental enforcement agencies to make sure it happens, to control all activity so that we can keep our sanctuary. Anyone know what the word sanctuary means? We're describing an ocean as a sanctuary, pure. So the tools of regulation are coming from all kinds of angles. Our mountains in Santa Cruz have 4 or 5 regulatory crossroads that from water quality control boards to the forestry board to the Monterey Bay Sanctuary and to a habitat conservation plan that will continue to try to make its way into our county, one after the other after the other. It's like having 5 ropes tying you from every angle. The goal is to create battered willing sellers. The term the government uses is, well, they're willing sellers. They sold it to us. Well, it's kind of like the kid in the playground who comes and puts your arm behind your back and starts to crank it up, up, up until you say uncle. Well, that's what the willing sellers selling to the government have become. But the worst of all of this is the Endangered Species Act, because that puts our worst fears into place, because bugs, plants, and animals are deemed more important than human beings. Again, what we must do is come to understand the Constitution. We need to repeal the Endangered Species Act. When government controls the natural resources in the land of America, it will control all of our action, because private property will become eliminated. So for those neighbors, friends, and family members of yours that have been lured by the idea of smart growth, ask them to check their premise. Is sprawl so bad? Is it really so horrible that our children have the choice about where they live and how they live, engaging in free trade amongst people who respect the property and the life of others? Is the development of water sources in the West such a horrible idea? We're breaking our dams in order to create a water shortage so that we tell our farmers that they can't irrigate their crops and they need to turn their land over to better land managers who know how to operate in this new world called sustainable development. And instead of spending hundreds of millions and nationally billions on rapid transit ideas that none of us want, is it really so bad that we use our gas taxes to build more lanes on freeways? Americans are financing double-decked freeways in Mexico City while we build these empty train lines that are designed to cart us around after a collapse. Well, I'd like to introduce you to who I think is the father of American sustainable development, a local citizen here in Maine, George Bush. Mr. Bush said in 1992, while still serving as president, that it is the sacred principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter to which the American people will henceforth pledge their allegiance. Now, what we need to remember is that these ideas behind the United Nations and the ideas behind the United States are antithetical to each other. One realizes that our rights as human beings are inherent, and the other seeks to make our rights the subject and object of elitist grant. So who's implementing Agenda 21, Sustainable Development in the United States? Well, all federal agencies. We've talked about that. Our tax dollars are being used in order to steal our freedom. But also so-called NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Now, there are 2,000 non-governmental organizations in the United States that have been accredited by the United Nations for purposes of implementing sustainable development. It includes the Nature Conservancy. It was so refreshing earlier this year to see the Washington Post expose the fraudulent financing vehicle for the theft of American landscapes from Americans that is the Nature Conservancy. The Sierra Club, whose primary mission is the collectivization of water in the West. You can go to any water board and I'll tell you the focus for the Sierra Club has been to get their people on water boards, and it's that way throughout Santa Cruz County. The Audubon Society, the American Planning Association, and the National Teachers Associations are all NGOs. But the third leg of this triage are the foundations. Now, the top 25 foundations in America, private foundations, tax-exempt foundations, are much larger than the top 25 multinational corporations. They seem to be regionalizing America with different foundations having dominion over certain areas. In Southern California, it's the Irvine Foundation. Where I live, the Central Coast of California, it's the Packard Foundation. We need to be wary of Rockefeller, Pew, Turner, Ford, Carnegie, MacArthur, community foundations, and others. The fourth and fifth estates of Agenda 21 that give support are some, not all, but some multinational corporations. Some are just opportunistic, and others are seeking to have a big seat at a shrinking table. And then the mainstream and consolidated media, which does not give attention to these issues. So what can you do? Well, for sure, stop contributing to green organizations, to those non-governmental organizations that are seeking the theft of private property. Because remember that these aren't really NGOs, non-governmental organizations. The words are always falsely put to us. They're really global governance organizations. They've taken their allegiance to the United Nations and to the Sustainable Development cause. Start reading, get your information about what sustainable development is, and you can begin by looking at freedom21santacruz.net. There will give you resources all over the country of the emerging movement to wake the American folks up. So the words we need to be wary of are Agenda 21, the United Nations, Sustainable Development, Smart Growth and Wildlands Project. But new meanings have been given to three key words in the Sustainable Development movement. Those words are environment, economy, and equity. These are the words that are preparing for the fall of American values. So what do they mean under this new sustainable development paradigm, as it's called? Well, equity is intended to use the law to re-engineer society and humanity itself. We see that with the environmental movement as it's intending and attempting to create guilt amongst our young people for even being alive. In our schools, death has become a key focus from time to time in our school curriculum. The economy is designed to redistribute America's wealth internationally. That's why our natural resource industries are under such pressure. In California, 80% of our wood is imported while our forests burn. And it is the replacement of free enterprise with government-private partnerships. Now, I don't know how they can get away with saying that. I mean, anybody who read anything in history knows that that's exactly what Benito Mussolini did. He created government-private partnerships, a system of economy that was followed by Adolf Hitler. When you eliminate the checks and balances that are naturally to exist between government and business, you create tyranny. By definition, it is necessary to separate, not combine, government and business. And the environment is the overlying issue here. But for them, the environment means nature, before man. There's a piece of land in Santa Cruz County that my wife and I bought in 1985. And this particular day was in May of 1986. I remember it well because that was the day we got married there. Now, it looked nice to us, had beautiful topography, great ocean views. Half of it was grasslands. The other half was impenetrable walls of poison oak as much as 40 feet high. But we still liked it. It was exciting for us. You couldn't walk, even though this is still in the springtime, you couldn't walk through these pasture grasses without plastic pants because you'd get stuck with the thistles and the burrs. But we spent the next 17 years, slow process of what we called seed bank management to transform this landscape and hopefully create something that we would consider glorious. Well, slowly, 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 like the Liberty Movement itself, we began to replace these plants by controlling the seeds that fell. Occasionally, we'd see some unique plant that we'd get identified as a native plant, and we'd nurture that plant along. And so in April of 2003, I'm going to take a view of what I've circled here. In April of 2003, that landscape looked like this. All native indigenous plants. In this section, hardly a weed there. The landscape was transformed by rigorous human disturbance, violating every concept of sustainable development land management. You see, people can achieve things working in their own interests and working cooperatively with others. Those are the ideals that are American. The precautionary principle which runs the sustainable development environmental policy is a fraud. It holds that people are a cancer upon the earth, and that if people undertake any action, it must, they say, cause no harm. So in other words, if you were to walk out on a landscape during the mating season of the red-legged frog, you'd have to demonstrate, in order not to violate sustainable development rules, that you didn't harm a frog that might have been out there. It turns the concept of justice on its head. Guilt is presumed and innocent must be proven. That is the legal dynamic of sustainable development. And in California, we now have what's called the KEELY, he's a Santa Cruz legislator, Environmental Crimes Bill. And we have 400 prosecutors roaming the state looking for environmental crimes, not gross polluters. I don't know any gross polluters. Our air has gotten awfully clean over the last 25 years. They're looking for people who are violating biodiversity rules, like walking on your own property after you've signed up on a best management practice program with the federal government when you shouldn't have been. You see, at the root of the environmental movement is a program to implement a political philosophy. It relies on deception, junk science, and poor stewardship. It answers the question, who decides? With the response, not you. It destroys the potential of a free society through regulations so that it can collectivize land. It invites dirty politics. And nowhere did that become more evident than with the administration of Gray Davis. It is very expensive. California and the United States are falling into a hole not just because of our military adventures, but sustainable development is costing us a ton. We are spending America into bankruptcy in order to steal America from Americans. Remember, support the repeal of the Endangered Species Act. Now, I described my experience with the local Agenda 21. I don't want anyone to think that those hard efforts didn't go unnoticed by important people in important places. Here's a letter from the Congress of the United States and our local representative, a man named Sam Farr, who's Leon Panetta's successor in Congress on the Central Coast of California. And this letter was written to the Agenda 21 committee, where Congressman Farr writes, I am writing to congratulate you, the Advisory Board and Action Santa Cruz Coalition, for completing the local Agenda 21 action plan. He goes on to say, I support the principle of sustainable development to balance the needs of, number one, economic growth, number two, environmental stewardship, and number three, social equity. I'm spearheading a similar effort to develop the planning process for sustainable development for the entire Monterey Bay region. But finally, and occasionally, Congressman Farr says something that's honest. The local Agenda 21 action plan not only has local significance, it will also have regional and national impacts. So why does Sam Farr say he's never heard of Agenda 21?
Yes, Congressman Farr, I'd like your my name's Daniel Beckett. I'd like your comments on the United Nations Agenda 21 program that you're implementing here. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
But you endorsed it, sir. I have your paperwork.
Welcome to the halls of Congress. Has deceit become the norm? Congressman Farr is the first congressman in our national elected assembly to, in his hallway, display the flag of the United Nations. But he's not the only one. Mr. Farr is a Democrat. Our Republican president said about 6 weeks ago in addressing the United Nations, quote, the United States of America is committed to the United Nations. The founding documents of the United Nations and the founding documents of America stand in the same tradition. Well, it's going to have to be the American people who begin to educate the American president about the nature of political philosophy. You see, the issue with elected officials is this. Are you a political internationalist or are you an American constitutionalist? There are two spirits within our Congress right now, and it is time to turn the bright lights on the political internationalists. Fortunately, support for Congressman Ron Paul's H.R. 1146, which calls for the withdrawal from the United Nations, is growing within Congress, and we need to encourage that process to continue. You see, resurrecting the American political system requires a Congress that does its job, that knows what Article 1, Section 8 is all about when it comes to limiting the scope of their power. So what can we do? Well, we can hold our local officials, whether they're the Congress or the City Council, accountable to the American constitutional system of government that is being undermined by a consensus process with predetermined outcomes. And I'd say that America needs a new Congress if America is going to remain the land of the free. Let's show ourselves to be the home of the brave. You can also participate by investigating, researching, writing, and speaking out in your own community, because every Agenda 21 program, remember it's global and local, that's their language, is infiltrated into our local levels. It's being implemented by people largely who don't know what they're doing or what it's all about. But our exposure can help reverse that tide. Support freedom advocacy groups and spread the spirit of liberty. Well, another question has to be asked and answered, and that is this. How is it that they are changing government? Is our government, as Al Gore said, being reinvented? You might remember his program called The Reinvention of Government that he talked about in the mid-90s. Well, there was some substance behind that silly talk, and I'm going to describe that by taking us on a quick ride. But first, we have to define a term, and that term is Soviet. Most Americans don't know what it means. It's just a nasty term that took the Russian people and the people of the Soviet bloc into economic and oblivion, destroying lives and opportunities. So what is a Soviet? Well, it's a system of councils that report to an apex council and implement a predetermined outcome. The members of a Soviet council are chosen by virtue of their willingness to comply with that outcome and their one-mindedness with a group. Soviets are the operating mechanism of a government-controlled economy, whether it be socialism or government-private partnerships. Well, buckle your seats, because I'm going to take you on a quick ride through the emerged, not emerging, emerged American Soviet. Action Pajaro Valley is where I live, covers this area here, and I can report that Action Pajaro Valley controls all decisions made by the city of Watsonville and the surrounding areas in terms of annexation programs, real estate development activities, school bonding financing. All these decisions are made by the Action Pajaro Council. But Action Pajaro doesn't sit in a vacuum. It's part of a larger Central California system of councils that cover all of our metropolitan areas. And that includes all of Silicon Valley and the entire San Francisco Bay Area. There are 8 of these so-called councils, and under them there are literally hundreds of subsidiary councils that do their dirty work. You see, the goal is to regionalize our governmental process, and this is how it's being done. This comes from Southern California. Vision 2020, one of those terms I talked about earlier, San Fernando Valley. Now, San Fernando Valley has a population of well over 1 million people. It's part of much of it's part of the city of Los Angeles. And you can see down at the bottom, economic development and business assistance. Now, what is some council doing, giving economic development and business assistance to the businesses for? Well, it's to find out who the friendly partners might be, who those compliant business operators are that'll join into this new world order. It's about workforce and education investment. Workforce and education? What are they planning to do with our children? It's about livable and sustainable communities. That means no cars. That means rail lines with assigned jobs. And so here's the system for Southern California. And here is a regionalized California. Now, Governor Schwarzenegger has replaced the wildlands chief, Mary Nichols, who came out of the Clinton department, who was implementing all kinds of draconian dynamics on rural California landowners, with a new person who comes right out of one of these councils, and this person's job will be to head up some new department of housing and education and smart growth activities. You see, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican. If you're in the political system today, it means you are quietly implementing this United Nations designed program for reordering American society. Here in Maine, I don't have the entire picture of how your system works, but all this stuff is available on the web. And researchers at Freedom 21, Santa Cruz, and other places can take any spot in America and give you the Soviet structure that has begun to take predominance over how our government functions. Now you say, well, how does this really happen? How's it coordinated? Well, this is one of the more curious aspects of the whole thing. ICLEI, or get this name, the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, is a United Nations NGO located in Toronto, Canada. Our county, Santa Cruz County, is listed as, and this is as early as 1997, as one of the premier implementers with ICLEI in coordination. In other words, what ICLEI does is it works with local governments in order to help them institute, and they have a whole bag of tricks, the kinds of programs necessary to get them on the sustainable development locomotive. Today, you'll see ICLEI working with communities throughout the United States. But it's also the federal agencies. This is the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA. Now, It's pretty easy to see that they've subscribed to sustainable development. The USDA is all over Santa Cruz County with free money for farmers if they sign up for sustainable development. In other words, if they transfer their management control of their land over to the federal government. So it's a combination of UN, NGOs, and federal agencies that are directing this program. These are the apex councils for the United States. And here are the regional head spots for areas across the country that duplicate what I showed you earlier in California. You see, the political consequence of regionalizing the United States is that we lose our limited constitutional government because the separation of powers between the branches of government and in the federal system itself are obliterated. Representative democracy goes away because it's these councils that are making the decisions, and the politicians simply rubber stamp it without input or knowledge by the people. Checks and balances are eliminated, and the replacement of political boundaries with unelected regional councils, usually based on watersheds or neighborhoods, begins to take preeminence. That was the system of the Soviet Union. There's a UN map showing how they intend to regionalize, ultimately, the Americas. And here it is on a worldwide basis. ICLEI hubs exist all around the world. You see, the real apex is outside the United States. Congressman Ron Paul, who I view as the highest elected constitutionalist in America, said this: "This is not a conservative problem, nor is it a liberal problem. It's a government intrusion problem that comes from both groups, albeit for different reasons. The problems emanate from both camps who champion different programs for different reasons. And the solution will come," he says, "when both groups realize that it is not merely a single party problem or just a liberal or a conservative problem. The problem is the abandonment of the principles of limited government. The issue is liberty." I tried over the last year or two to picture in my mind and create a pictorial that begins to describe what I think we could call as a dialectic in American politics. What a dialectic is the idea that you establish a thesis and you create its antithesis, understanding that those two concepts will synthesize to what it is you really want the outcome to become. So in looking at the contemporary world and how it is that a global green cartel is coming to America, I've applied these old, nasty philosopher principles. You know, dialectic is a concept from Marx and Kant and Hegel before that, and see how it plays today. And so I look at the thesis, the right-wing collectivist, the government-private partnership combination, and viewed their antithesis, which is sustainable development, protect the bugs, make the tree huggers happy. And the synthesis of that, amazingly, is Agenda 21. It's stakeholder consensus councils to create a reinvented new form for government. And what happens then is you go through this narrow little digestion track, which Al Gore said, Al Gore obviously a mainstay in the sustainable development movement. He said America must go through a wrenching transformation. Well, that's where it is, as we move into a government-controlled society right on our way to tyranny. So what you have is right-wingers subscribing to smart growth, some right-wingers, those who want to have power and control over others, working with those greenies who are implementing a wildlands project. In order to bring us down to Agenda 21, a regionalized America where property is collectivized and the UN Charter becomes implemented. What's interesting about the right-wing collectivists and the left-wing collectivists is they do agree on some things. They're both willing to use fraud to create a police state. They both approve of an interventionist foreign military policy. where America embarks on wars without constitutional authorization via declarations of war. And they both approve of a government education policy that serves collectivist ends. Now, sure, each one wants to have the details ruled by them, but that's just a phony fight. The fight is over liberty and tyranny, not over which tyrant is in control. Back to the idea of collectivism. You see, the idea of the New World equity grows right out of the same principles that ran the Soviet Union for so long. And the economics of this New World Order grow right out of the policies of Mussolini and Hitler. You see, the emblem for sustainable development are three connecting rings. You'll see it on their documentation everywhere. And if you look at these Soviet councils that are all across America, they've always interposed three wings using these basic terms as their guiding light. But overlying the equity and the economy aspects of this is a big green blanket called the environment. And there we have the three connecting rings of the New World Order, or Sustainable Development, Agenda 21. A group of us citizens in Santa Cruz have formed, and our numbers are growing as people slowly begin to absorb the reality of what's affecting us. And we formed an organization called Freedom 21 Santa Cruz. And what we do is put out advanced bulletins periodically showing how the Soviet is being implemented in Santa Cruz, who's doing it, what they're up to. We do research analysis and provide documents on both a national, international, and local level to show how this is all linked. And we provide information on freedom sources. But what we're really trying to do is provide a model for other communities to begin to educate their own citizenry about how our freedom and our liberty hangs in the balance. So what's important is that you spread the word to your friends and that we move the dialogue forward in America about what our threat really is. At Freedom 21 Santa Cruz, we found our principles on the ideas of constitutional government, private property, family autonomy, and security for our nation. You see, liberty offers us a choice. The genuine political spectrum is not left-right, it is up-down. It is between liberty and tyranny. And the question you must ask yourself, and others must ask themselves, is do we want a life of our own, or are you satisfied in becoming a biological resource? In reviewing sustainable development, realize that it is a political movement to establish a global state collective. The sustainable developers use the mainstream environmental movement as a poisonous candy to steal America's land and consequently our freedom. Private property secures a healthier planet. Know that sustainable developers are establishing an American Soviet right under our noses. But finally, realize that the premise of the founding ideas of the United Nations and the United States are diametrically opposed. The foundational principles of the United States of America are facing a great threat. Posterity will long live with the consequences of the battle over sustainable development and the anti-human ideas that it represents. Sustainable development activists and supporters are often, but not always, unaware of the tyranny is the consequence of their environmental, social equity, and economic movement. Yet these dire circumstances also propel the greatest opportunity in history to advance individual liberty, human happiness, and genuine peace. As the Sustainable Development Initiative gains strength, and in the short term it will, it is wise to recall what George Washington said. Private property and freedom are inseparable. Freedom and a healthy planet are also inseparable. If Americans come to a timely understanding of the threat and face the challenge squarely, the deceptive fraud of sustainable development will quickly come to light. America will rise to restore liberty through an orderly transformation directed by reason and respect for the dignity of individual determination. We, you and me, are charged with protecting the ideals of liberty and private property. As the implications of sustainable development become clear, America's parents and grandparents will increasingly come to understand the consequences of eliminating private property. The circle sounding Paul Revere's warning is growing. Join in now, because the green coats are a-coming. Protect your property, protect your children, and protect the American experiment. Draw upon the heritage of American industriousness, the hope that springs eternally from Western civilization's culture, and the human spirit to expose sustainable development and advance freedom in the 21st century. Thank you, and long live freedom.